more of a conversation, and if you're looking for a deep discussion on the legal pros and cons of each license, I've come to the wrong place. I swear I will underwhelm you. But hopefully I'll give you an idea of what the pros and cons and the intention of open source licensing is. My name is Kane McLean. If you're wondering why I'm here, only Mark knows that. I'm not sure Mark actually knows why. I met Mark 4 years ago, ish. Yeah, we were working on a project together for RMF documentation. So in the security world, but not really the true security geeks, right? Which has kind of been the theme of my career. I've been in a lot of different areas, but not the hardcore guy. I picked up most of the a level of understanding that I can take and support other people with. So I wound up finding myself as a middleman to a lot of folks. I've supported 4 Army Chiefs of Staff from Casey all the way through Milley. My last meeting with Milley was in the National Military Command Center. Fun story, first time I wound up there was by accident. I followed someone's directions, but I started at the wrong place in the Pentagon. I was escorted out under arms. And the last time I was there at the invitation of the Chief of Staff of the Army. So it's a fun way to... Whoops. Did we lock it?
It's Frederick, KeyLUG is password.
You just gave your password out in your group in front of the security guys?
It's a presentation account that I'll be nuking at the end of this.
And I'm in Patrick's Gmail.
And then wiping my...
What is it again?
Frederick, KeyLUG, all lowercase.
See if I can type. Cool. There it is. After the better part of a decade at the Pentagon, I supported some consulting here and there, which is when I met Mark. Then I went to support directly support the CIO at the Department of Energy. And now I find myself working with GSA to transition the entire telecom infrastructure for the enterprise for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So leaving a roughly just a shade under 300 million business volume in telecom services that have to support many open source projects because HHS is a very unique environment. So not completely OSS, but there's a lot of stuff that's running that they have that it's kind of weird. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, or what I've done in a nutshell. Today we're going to talk about open source licensing, protecting and leveraging the power of intention. It's a different take on licensing. Because open source licensing starts at a different place and it has a very different purpose and it does a lot of different things that normal licensing doesn't do. But before we kind of get into that, I want to get your ideas. What is open source?
And it has a very different purpose and it does a lot.
That's a terrifying sound. No one wants to hear their voice, right? Something weird about it. What is open source to you guys?
First thing I think of when I think of open source is the community behind it, especially in Linux and just a lot of open source things on GitHub. There's a lot of people involved that you really wouldn't see if it was closed source.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, this is probably not a good way to think about it, but part of me feels as though open source is more secure. Not always, but sometimes more secure because there's more eyes on it. There's the community involved with it that's providing more eyes on it. So it's I like open source because it's out there. It's got more to it than I think closed source. Especially a lot of the things that I've been involved with that are closed source. I'm like, man, this is really crappy code. It'd be pretty good if it was open source. It'd probably have some more eyes on it that would help fix some of these problems. So I guess that's what open source is to me. Is just open and more involved code.
So to summarize, community, which is a key aspect of open source. People don't really think of it as that when they think of the licensing structure, but it is a vital part of it. And that community provides more eyes. And the famous line is, many eyes make few bugs. So that's been around forever. So without the many eyes, that the community, you don't have a security model that open source relies on. And that security model is part of the fundamental argument, particularly in secure mission critical places. Is the more people who have eyes, the quicker you find out what's really there.
I think giving back. So I know that probably circles in the same realm of community, but giving back and collaboration.
Okay, so aspect of community and contribution. What you're doing gets recognized, or at least shared.
Yeah, I agree with both. I like to add that it brings you security plus room for improvement. 100%.
I mean, I'm thinking, in this regard about when you have more people involved, you have a greater oversight and better ethics, because people are looking to protect each other in the community. And yes, you get the bad ones out there. And it's like, when you think about pen testing and so forth with KeyLUG and other tools, but nonetheless, there are good people out there, which leads to good ethical hacking, and and watching these tools be able to that they're free. We want to make sure that everyone can use them without harm. I don't know if that fits
Yeah.
into the mold.
Actually, there's a very important thing that you touched on, the concept of ethics.
Yeah.
It fits right in the community. So when a project, for it to be taken seriously, it has to have a good governance structure. Very thank you. I'll just keep playing with it. Once I get playing with the slides, we'll punch through quick.
It's a quick fix. That's it. Just release. Anybody remember how to change the?
Screensaver.
Power. Here we go. Screen brightness. Here we go. I'll never. Let's go with that. Sorry.
No worries, man. Thank you. Appreciate it, Patrick. So community governance. Something that you find, I won't say unique, but it is more ruthless in open source projects, because for a project to be taken seriously by the community and by the users of that project, the governance structure has to be intact, and everyone has to know, because we're all volunteers in many, not all, but a lot of us are volunteers committing code to repositories, that we're all playing by the same rules. Otherwise, I'll just go play on another project.
Yeah.
And unless I've got a very specific reason to be on this project that's going to override that, I'm just going to be a disgruntled contributor.
Yeah.
That governance model has to be ruthless. And you don't find the favoritism that you do in a lot of proprietary projects. So in a company like Microsoft, you can find a lot of times favorites will get played and things will get moved up. And Microsoft has an unusual corporate habit. People who are good at stuff get promoted. So they move very quickly to their Peter principle. So if you're a really good coder, you may be managing a group of coders. Problem with that is, while you might be good at writing it, you may not be good at organizing their time, you may not be good at mentoring other people. These other skills that go with management, you may not have, but they've now pushed you into this place. And so if you don't have those skills, you tend to rely on the people I know, and I know they can get that done, and I see what they were doing, and now there's the favorite environment. It's really easy to see that when you don't have the open situation, or at least see it developing it when you don't have that open situation. That we have. So Mark, what is open source to you, sir?
Open source to me is the opportunity for the community to see something. So something is out in the open is better watched, it's better taken care of. You also, like others have mentioned, you have more eyes on it. There's more of an opportunity to find a problem. and to fix it. And once you find a problem, you have these other ideas coming in as to how to fix it. Because often, as we all know, when you fix one problem, you fix one bug, you've created 5 others in the process of fixing that one. And so that's helpful. It's still, but the problem is the community has to actually be active. I think the SSL vulnerability that had been there for years and years and years, and had just been discovered recently, this was from a few years ago recently, is a good example of why open source has to actually exercise its community in actuality, not just theory,
Right.
to make it work. So it's helpful to have someone kind of watching over that to make sure that it's happening. So these facilitators, a good facilitator is going to reach out to people, and that's a skill that's needed in that community beyond just coding. Because for the coders to be effective, you need somebody to help them be effective, to watch after that. So it's sort of like watching. They're watching over them, but they're also watching their back.
Right.
So that's what open source is to me.
Cool.
Another phrase, another thing I think about is generosity, the kindness of people to develop this and make a lot of it, so much of it free. And also the impact of all this software. I just finished a 2-week cybersecurity boot camp and learning about GPG keys and, a lot of tools in Kali Linux and things like that. We wouldn't have had that if it wasn't for this wonderful community. Being able to donate and devote such passion to software that people can have at their fingertips without having to pay for it. But then on the flip side, you still have those who are malcontents that still will put software out there that you have to be mindful of, even if it's in violation of copyright and violation of laws.
And there's a lot of times that you can violate copyright without realizing it. So there's some, we'll talk about compatibility of licensing in a bit, but some folks do that unwittingly and other people do it maliciously. So there's a distinction there. So the main thing that everyone mentions community, and that's the first thing most folks who are involved in Linux and other open source projects, you think of WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, if you're anywhere near government websites, people think of the community. I can go talk to people and learn stuff. And then some companies like Acquia, who own Drupal, they poach out of the community. So they use the community as their development, or not development base, but their human resource grooming place. They find out folks who learn on their own and pull them out. You mentioned the folks who are sharing, and you mentioned sharing. Surprisingly, folks like that are a very small portion of the open source community. A study 2 years ago, I believe, in the EU found that over 74%, just a shade over 74% of all open source contributions from EU participants came from companies that had 380,000 employees or more. So those folks are getting paid by their companies to do the things that their companies need to get into the projects that they need, and then the community sustains them. So the company then relies on the community. So not all of our contributors are necessarily lone wolves. A lot of them are corporate folks going, hey, we need this involved in something. And some of those corporate folks are as big as the U.S. government, as we'll see in a little bit. Let me tap this. So,
Try to click the mouse button.
not frozen. Did I break it?
There we go.
Okay, thank you. So most of us who get in open source start with Linux. I started in 2003 with a stage 1 Gentoo tarball, and took 3 days to compile on my desktop. And hi. Oh, that's right. So after 3 days of compiling, I did not even have a GUI. I had a command prompt, and that was it. And I did, like Patrick, the full 100% commitment to it. I spent a decade on running nothing but Linux. I've used Red Hat mostly on servers, production servers, and Ubuntu and Gentoo, Fedora a little bit in the Red Hat realm, but mostly it's been Gentoo and Ubuntu have been the ones that I've gone to. Kali's fun to play with, even back when it was Backtracks. And you find a spot, you find a thing that's interesting, and you get going, and you start tweaking, and it becomes addictive, right? So, the thing we're going to talk about now that we're finally through all the chatter, and you'll find I ramble a lot. I apologize in advance. We've talked a little bit about what is open source to y'all. We'll go through some history and talk about who put the open in open, what determines and who determines if software is open. We'll talk about the licensing part of it, which is why Mac actually asked me to come. And then when I saw his teaser, it was a little bit more than just that, so we'll go into some of the others. But one thing I want to kind of key in on is the power of intention. And it's a shorter section, but it really demonstrates what intention can do and whose intention is driving what goes forward and what intentions actually are. And there'll be more discussion in the slide, but that's cool. And then we'll talk about open source and government, since Mark mentioned that as well. And I've got some background there. And by some, I mean a lot. So, all right. Open source software. There are a lot of definitions. The one I like best, not just because I spent most of my time in the Pentagon, but because it's the cleanest definition I've seen that takes into account OSI. The Department of Defense, in its 2009 memo, defined open source as software for which the human readable source code is available for use, study, reuse, modification, enhancement, and redistribution by the users of that software. No matter how you look at it, pretty much all open source software is created collaboratively. At some level, there's sharing going on, and that is the intention. Sometimes that sharing is private, sometimes that sharing is public. I've seen a lot of projects that y'all will never hear about because they are in very, very secure places doing some very interesting things. And we can't talk about it outside of the security wire. And that's fine. It can still be open source there. Convincing people of that in the military is a very difficult thing to do. But just because you're going to share something doesn't mean you have to share it with literally everybody. You can share it with anyone who's got security clearance. You can put those type of restrictions on it. Or you can just say it's open, but the nature of the project, the government marks it a national security asset, and then the national security regulations are the ones that actually take over who can see something. So there are a lot of places to share, a lot of ways to share, and just because you get caught up in the idea of open doesn't mean it has to go to everyone and you don't have to push copies to everyone. So I pulled out some key dates that are relative to the licensing part of this and what kind of created open. And as you can see, my date format doesn't translate well across the different tools here, but that's fine. It just makes it cooler to look at. So back in '55, back when really, really tight crew cuts were the thing, and everyone wore white shirts and black ties to work and wore pocket protectors, IBM made all of its source code free and available. Why? Because they had this massive piece of really expensive hardware, and they wanted you to buy that. And in order for you to have it useful to you, you had to have software. But guess what? Nobody's really writing software because IBM's the only one with this giant box. So they gave you software, which you could take and tinker with, and you would compile it when you were done on your own machine. That was all great. Everyone's thrilled. I can do stuff that I want. And then some other people came along and go, hey, I can write software, but IBM won't distribute it. So the federal government, through several different legal cases, which I don't remember and didn't reference, came to the conclusion that Microsoft had created for itself a monopoly. Kind of by accident, it backed into it, but it had to start separating and charging for its software so that it could then compete with other people. And in that sense, big government ended the first software movement, open source software movement, and created the software industry at the same time. In '83, a good guy by the name of Richard Stallman starts the GNU project. That's the beginning of the free software movement. I'm sure y'all are familiar with Stallman. If you ever want a really interesting read, find his speaking writer. He's got some very interesting requirements and options, particularly for pets, if you want to have them around him. It's a fun read. But his idea of free, the free is in speech, free speech is not free beer statement. That's Richard Stallman, if you're not connecting. He was one of the early folks to kind of bring that in. He liked the free software terminology, but it didn't really resonate with a lot of folks. So his manifesto was really the foundation of a lot of stuff, but it had some things that it didn't quite cover, and it was a little too demanding on sharing. 1985, the very next year, or after his manifesto is written, GPL version 1 is released. And that's the first open source software license that we have. 91, Linus Torvalds comes along, and he is not noble, he is a malcontent, upset that he cannot actually get his hands on Unix. So he says, I can create this, and starts a project that he calls Freaks. And I believe it was a takeoff on the old phreaking, if y'all remember phone phreaking.
No.
So the old phone systems, the old A2s that you used to see when you were kids, they actually relied on dial tone.
Oh yeah.
Those tones meant something. So if you could mimic the tones, you do all kinds of different things.
Oh wow.
With your Captain Crunch whistle.
Right.
Exactly. Exactly. So phone phreaking is actually how Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met. They were both into phone phreaking, and they got hooked up that way. But Freaks was kind of a play off of Unix, because he wanted to freak the Unix system. So he added an X at the end of it to tie it together. Then after a very brief amount of time, a guy named Ari Lemick was one of the main contributors to that project once he got it going. And he suggested renaming it Linux to give it a little bit more legitimacy, because freaking was widely considered illegal. And so Linus accepted that change. And in a fun note, Torvalds also was the foundation of Git, and somebody asked him why projects keep getting weird names, you got Linux, and he goes, well, I tend to name stuff after myself. So, a little self-deprecating humor on the Git name. So then we get free BSD. That's a foundational license that comes along. And then Eric Raymond adopts the term open source in his work, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which if you have not read it, I highly recommend it. The basic principle is people tend to go where there's value, not because there's a command structure in place. And he draws, if you look at a hierarchy of a well-organized organization, it looks like a cathedral, the org chart does. But if you look at a bazaar or a flea market, the value, the big tents are wherever people find value. And if they don't find value at your tent, they go somewhere else. So that's really the open source model in a nutshell, but it's been very well articulated, and how to maintain some of those things that keep people coming to your big tent is an important part of his work. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Then 1998, the Open Source Initiative is created by Eric Raymond and Bruce Perez. They legally own the open source definition. So that is a trademark. It is a thing that they do, and they define the 10 freedoms. Open source. So who determines if a license is open source? Well, as I just said, the OSI does. Originally, they derived the main concepts for the open source definition from the Debian software guidelines, and it hasn't been modified in over a decade. So they've pretty well landed on what it should be. Open source doesn't just mean access to the code; it also lays out distribution requirements. and sharing requirements. The 10 freedoms of open source, free distribution, redistribution. The actual access to the source code itself. Derived works are covered. So if you create something built on somebody else's work, then their work gets pulled into your release. You've got to respect the original software license. Integrity of the author's source code. No discrimination against persons or groups. So if you don't like a competing project and they want to use part of your code, sorry, they get to use it if you're going to remain open source. And that's creates some very interesting situations. What was that, 5 years ago, I think, Perl was designated an essential software by the U.S. government. So Perl's a programming language, right?
So, like,
Yeah. So if you haven't noticed, the government is slow to catch up on things. When I was supporting the Army, we used to say that if it doesn't kill people or blow things up, it's usually a decade behind. That's true everywhere. But they finally identified a language, and I think it's one of the few languages that's actually defined as a national asset. And so in order to have that situation, there are rules and regulations that govern. Somebody's got to be there to maintain it. It's got to be, it can't just go stagnant and then we're stuck with a legacy system. We've done that too many times in the past. For example, there's a alloy that was used on the Apollo 11 missions. No one knows how to make that alloy anymore. So the government does not want to get itself in that situation with digital assets. So government goes, Perl, congratulations, you're now on the list. You need to provide us all this documentation and your business plan and how your things are going to continue should the worst happen to your company. And Perl's response was, cool, we're flattered that that you're doing that, and great news that you're using our code, but we didn't agree to that. That's not our business model. And so the pushback was, it went on for about a year, and Google or the Perl folks didn't have a problem with the situation. They just had a problem with having obligations put on it. They really didn't want to be in the situation at all, but because they're open source, there's no discrimination against persons or groups. The discrimination that they could have taken was, hey, we're just not going to play, you're not allowed to use Perl. If they had been another project, they could have revoked the license. But the licensing structure is such that they can't do that. So to maintain that situation, and for the government to be satisfied, ultimately what happened was a third party stepped in and said, should the worst happen, we will continue to pick up and maintain and consult on Perl. And oh, by the way, we would like a big fat check for that.
yeah.
And the government went, well, we're paying for stability.
Here's your check.
Here's your money. And that happens a lot. And that's one of the business models we can talk about in a minute here. Distribution of the licensing is another aspect of it. No discrimination against fields or endeavors. So if you're looking at the Google situation not long ago where the company said we don't want to be a warfaring company, and there was all that pushback, that actually is directly in violation of the freedom number 6, because warfare is unfortunately an endeavor, and a particular field. What do they call it? The profession of arms is the phrase they use. So Google's many of its open source licenses may or may not violate that, and the OSI may or may not take that up. Probably not, because Google's a behemoth. They just are going to let that go. I'm sure it'll just kind of disappear from consciousness soon. And another aspect is your licenses must not be specific to a product. So you've got the GPL, it can be applied to just about anything. You've got several versions of GPL, the MIT license, and you just the license outlines a concept of how you're going to share something. not how it's going to relate to that particular product. So RHEL doesn't have its own licensing structure. It uses GPL3.
GPL, some version of GPL, I don't know
Yeah, I
which.
think
Rich,
it's either
Rich is not here, he
GPL3.
could tell you right off.
Gotcha. See, I promised to underwhelm you with my licensing knowledge. So licenses must also not restrict other software. Because these licenses often have to work together as you integrate different systems and things into your product, like OpenSSL being used by Mozilla and virtually everyone. You can't discriminate against another project itself. And licenses must be technology neutral. So we're back to that concept of not locking into any one thing. A license is a concept.
So real quick,
Yeah.
something you said earlier kind of has resonated with me for the last couple of minutes. That number one there, free redistribution. Earlier you said the United States government, obviously they are huge open source proponents. Obviously they write code that is open source to them, but because of what's been changed, may be of national defense
Mm-hmm.
blocking
Right.
and inside those walled off areas.
Right.
No longer freely distributed. How does it maintain the open source?
Yes and no. So there's. Well,
It's not freely distributed if someone
It
without a
is.
clearance can't get to it.
Right.
yes, it can be. And let me go back to a specific project I worked on a few years ago. Army's medical command has to interact with Army's installation command because hospitals don't actually run the facilities they're in; they run the people. So these two commands interact very closely, and there are several systems that actually have to interact with each other. So case management is one, and those things also have to interact with local law enforcement and in some cases federal law enforcement. In the late 90s, early 2000s, a company in California came up with a software platform to do this. It was proprietary, and they stopped supporting it 8 or 9 years ago. Really ticked off the Army. And not only did they stop supporting it, they started reselling it to every other branch of the military. So Air Force is using a blue version of the same software. They just changed the interface. Navy's using it. Air Force is using it. And nobody's getting any support, but this stuff is still being sold. And the project I was brought in on was to see if we can rest the code free, A, and then if not, write new code to replace the function. That code is going to be open source. The key challenge is we never again, this is the program manager speaking, we never again want to be stuck in a place where a vendor holds hostage our code and our data for this particular scenario. So in order to get that code, you have to be on the project in some way, somehow tied to it, because of the secure information that it does hold, because it does contain information about certain individuals, not the code itself. But the data in the system is where the secret sauce really is. The system itself has to be marked as secure. So what they did was, the approach they used, they put an open source license on it. They let the security regulations determine who gets it. But if you're on company A and KeyLUG's on company B, you've screwed the pooch because you're not doing the job that you were hired to do. Now, because it's under open source, you cannot fight them for the code. When they want to bring in KeyLUG's company to fix your problems, you just have to hand over a copy of your code and go, this sucks, but if I'd done a better job, we wouldn't be in this situation. Or you want to bring in somebody to do something special. Like we've got 30 people in our company, it's a small company, and this Northrop Grumman can write this one special module for us to interact with this other system. You can bring Northrop in to do the work because they've got more knowledge and skill in that area, and you can freely share the code with them. So it is open, but open does not require worldwide distribution. And that's the key there. So it prevents the vendor lock-in situation, which they were really freaked out about in Port Sam and Houston. And then it also allows you to collaborate freely with others without having to worry about it. And does this scale? Yes, there are weapon systems running on open source in that security environment. There are security systems for those weapon systems that are open source, that are running in that same type of environment. If you need to know, and it's demonstrated, and somebody signs off on your need to know, welcome inside the wire, and you get whatever you need. But if this had been a proprietary system, like the first company that was fired, not your company, but the one that we brought you in to fix, then what they did was they held their code hostage. They also held the data hostage because the government never actually paid to have a method of extracting the data from the system. So you've got secure records that it's a really bad situation. So once you're inside the wire, you can share freely, and that's the key. Is you're still there and you're still sharing, and you can't hold the government hostage in that situation. Does that help?
Yeah.
All right. Who determines if software is open? So, question we asked earlier. Who determines if the license is open? That's OSI. Who determines if the software is going to be open source? Well, as with all creative works, that's going to be the author. So you get to determine how I license my stuff. And this opens up a different conversation. What is the thing you're licensing in open source? Is it protected by copyright or is it protected by patent? It depends. So if you're Matt Mullenweg, everyone know who he is?
Who?
The guy who founded WordPress, Mullenweg. So he's got a line in that he uses as his tagline for his company. Code is poetry. He looks at creative work as a creative endeavor. All creative endeavors, creative works of any kind are covered by copyright. So copyright applies. But inventions are covered by patent law. So this is where software crosses back and forth in this odd place, and it does this very interesting dance that lawyers for the government, particularly the Department of Energy, will keep you going, pulling your hair out for months at a time, because not everything covers everything. So just because you've created something that works, and if you can truly consider it purely an artistic expression or a creative work, I'm writing a web page or something like that, and once I write it, it's there, it's done, then usually copyright can cover that. If you've created an algorithm, a process, or some other thing that qualifies as an invention within that creative work, now you've crossed into patent law. Patent law is a black hole that people get paid a lot of money to understand. But that's also where you see in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, patent trolls were just sitting around waiting for companies to take a wrong step and then go, I own that patent. It's a mess once you get into that.
Still do that.
They still do. It's harder now, but they still do. And a lot of the types of patents will depend. So you can get a design patent, so the case for your laptop is under a design patent probably. If you've got something as unique as the Apple products, right? They're part of the brand. So they take the great pains to get design patents for them. Other companies like Dell, not so much. Pretty vanilla. They stay away from trying to get it too interesting. But then there's process patents as well. Process patents are the ones that really deal with the moneymaker part of patent trolling. So if you've got a process patent, you now, I think, have a 14-year limitation. You have to do something or start doing something with whatever you've patented within 1 year. And then you have 14 years to bring it to fruition. If you can't do that in 14 years, your patent lapses, and you have to reapply. And for a medium-sized company to reapply for a patent, you're looking at around $310,000. So it's not a cheap endeavor. Patent trolling is a investment, if you're gonna look at it from that perspective. And it scales. So if you're an individual and you wanna file for a patent, it's a lot cheaper. If you're Dell and you're filing for a patent, it's a lot more expensive. So there's a balance to be struck there. Yes, ma'am.
I'm gonna throw a wrench into this. How does intellectual property law play into all of this?
So all of this is intellectual property law.
Okay,
So IP
that's right.
IP is covered mostly by patents and copyright.
Right, I know the patent side, I wasn't sure about, say, for example, yes, we have open source and we can design the software. The code itself, like the actual language may be open source, but if the entity of the product you put together and you sell it for commercial use, how does that binding affect being open source? I know you were saying earlier, you can call on a company to redo someone's software, but what do you do in this case?
Don't totally
Say
understand
you
the
compile
question.
the software and you
Illustration?
don't make it available,
So if you have software but you don't make it available,
yeah, does that become closed source then?
well, this open source part of it is going to depend on what licensing you chose.
Okay,
So there are a lot of open source projects that people just don't know about. The code never gets distributed.
okay.
And I've got a stat coming up in a second. It covers how many projects there are at the moment, and it's
Okay.
an amazing amount. Like free speech doesn't give people the right, or doesn't demand that people agree with you.
Right,
Just making something open source doesn't demand that people distribute it for
Right.
you. But that doesn't change the intention of the author. So between those two concepts of copyright and patent, unlike a patent, which is an expensive process, copyright happens the moment you finish. So if you take a photograph, the moment you click the shutter, you own the copyright for that photograph. Software is the same way. The moment you write it, you own the copyright unless it has a process that you want to then take further and patent. All right. Why is open source licensing different? Well, it's because it started with software developers, not lawyers. So the developers created the concept. So they wanted to protect their intention. If you think about it, all licensing really protects intention. I have something, you want it. The license is our agreement on how we're going to get from me to you. The exchange of value is usually the consideration that is involved. You're going to give me money, or you're going to give me access to a bigger project, or you're going to promise me this, that, or the other in a deal that we work out. That's typically how licensing happens. And you can license anything. So if you've bought a t-shirt with the Superman logo on it, that logo has actually been licensed. It's a creative work. Patents and copyrighted items can be licensed. The thing that's different about open source is that the intention is not to protect the financial interest of the creator. The intention is to protect the shareability of the code. That is a radically different position. And it changes the end game for all licensing when you talk about open source. So, intention to share is a different game. We just talked about the licenses.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going back to the closed off wall of things that the governments that our government has. And don't get me wrong, I fully support our government and the ability to use open source to do the things they have to do. But I'm playing devil's advocate on that last statement, and I promise I'll stop. If I write open source code as a person in the world that says, okay, I want this to be freely distributed, how is an organization able to then take that, use it, and then close it off inside their network and not violate my intention of the license?
Two different things going on there. First, you mentioned their use of it being closed off. So the usage is you can't discriminate against the usage.
Okay,
So you write Perl, you can't prevent me from using Perl.
gotcha.
even if I'm using it to, you know, commit genocide in third world countries, which would be a nice thing to be able to do, but we don't discriminate against anything, no matter how horrible it is, or how much we are going to financially lose from it. The other thing you mentioned was modify it. So any modifications I make will be under whatever license I choose to put that under, and whatever restrictions would be under there. And my use of Perl in this illustration doesn't mean that the initial Perl project gets shut down. It's still out there going and doing everything it wants to do. I might have written a modification for it, and if I need to protect that, I can, and if I don't, I can share it back. And we'll talk about how the government's actually been proactive about sharing things back in some really weird places. We'll get to that toward the end. But the national security laws are the ones that really control who can share what back out. Dr. David Wheeler put together a really good releasability chart and walked through the FAR and DFARs for the Department of Defense. FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. But this chart is, I think, 7 different scenarios under which software can be created by the government. Can we share it out? If yes, proceed. If no, proceed here. And it walks through each of those and it gets to yes, no, or you would have to get this permission to do that. And I got that somewhere. I can share that with you if you want. It used to be on the MillOSS website, but the maintainer of that site has somehow screwed something up with his account at GoDaddy and he can't get it, and the site's now offline, as often happens with open source groups, right? So does that answer that question?
I think so.
Okay,
So
for now.
I think you and I might know some of the same people.
Very possibly. Absolutely. You probably do. If you've been involved in MillOSS, you probably know some of the same folks.
So, I'm trying to put this question and your response together. So you're telling me I write a code, like okay, I write this, and the government takes this and adds on to it. What I wrote is open source, but what they add to it is what they can control. And that's what is, depending on the type of license they want, does not have to be open source.
Correct.
Unless you're licensed.
So
with the
basically,
There are licenses that state that correct me if I'm wrong, there are licenses that state that if somebody makes modifications, those also have to be contributed back.
That's a GPL.
Yeah. So, make modifications is not the same as write modules that plug into it. There is a key distinction. Typically, when this is a best practice, not a policy. Typically, when the government tries to do that, it wants to have control of the modules because those modules can be reused. DoD does not like to engage in re-problem solving. If I've solved the same one problem, that a bureaucracy the size of DoD, 60% of the federal government's budget, I probably have that same problem somewhere else. So I want to reuse that code as much as I can. So they tend to write modules, they tend to write plugins, they tend to write things that we don't have to deal with maintaining the core. Instead, let the community maintain the core, we'll leverage what they've done. Sometimes they will contribute back to the core. And as an example with the ESN Vault, I'll get into later on, they've actually contributed to the Linux kernel itself. So under an open source license. But I've gone completely off track. The original question was?
No,
I get chatty.
I'm good.
Okay. But if you deal with the modules, the objects, you can control the objects and you can then determine if those are shareable or not. And the policy that currently is in place is if it's shareable, share it. If it's not, then you need to cite whatever national security reason that you've got. If you're familiar with the federal source code policy, it lays out some pretty demanding reuse rules for it. And that was fun. Getting those things handled out was not as fun as it sounds. But we'll talk about that in a bit. You will have more questions because of whatever background you've been involved in drives those questions, and I've had those for months with some very senior folks. I had to explain how this all works to the Undersecretary of the Army. And pieces from the foundational white paper that I wrote for him actually made it into principles in the federal source code policy.
Wow.
So this conversation, once you get your head around it, it makes sense.
It's a great conversation.
But getting your head around it,
Yeah.
that's a hard
Well, the issue is, like you said earlier, it's at its core, it's a battle between developers and lawyers,
Yes.
and that's the hard part.
And the lawyers are so entrenched in the idea that you want to protect your interests,
Yeah.
which means your ability to make money from the code. Developers have this different thing. They want to protect the shareability of the code. They're not actually interested in their interests because they're getting funded through a wide variety of other ways. So that the lawyers are going, what's wrong with you hippies? And the hippies are going, what's wrong with you stodgy old people?
Yeah.
You know? So there's a fundamental problem there. And if they could take the time to really understand each other's end game, they could come to a better working arrangement in most cases. But the end game is a whole different world.
I used to stay on my code.
Yeah.
Hippies or
Yeah, 'cause they call me a
stodgy old-
hippie and they're stodgy.
Amazing.
So we've already talked about what is a license, the objective of open source licensing. We've kind of been talking about this for the past few minutes. So the open source license, its objective is to protect its shareability. Protecting any license protects the intention of the IP owner, the intellectual property owner. Historically, that's the intention is to make a lot of money from my work. Open source, the intention is to make this as shareable as possible. That's a radically different position, and most people don't have an easy time getting their head around why that would be. There are three really common aspects to open source licensing. It encourages uncontrolled combination and reuse. Unlike most proprietary systems, they think of their system as this is my thing because it's got my branding and this is what I sell, and I want you to use Microsoft Office, not this LibreOffice thing. LibreOffice goes, hey, if you can plug other stuff into this, that's freaking cool. Do more of that. So that's like a hands-on illustration of that uncontrolled combination of reuse. Typically, there are no acceptance procedures. That's unique to open source licenses. You use it, that's all we need to say that you accepted it. And the last thing is it often imposes sharing obligations on others. Doesn't always, but it often does. There are two real classifications. Though they're not formal classifications, I use that term. Licenses tend to be permissive or restrictive or somewhere on that spectrum of in between. And that is going to be determined by how much they let you do with their code and how much they let you share with the code. Restrictive licenses, like copyleft and the GPL, say these are the things you must do. If you use our stuff, you have to share it. You've got to do this, that, or the other in order to, use our software. And they want to protect the continued sharing of that. Other licenses that are permissive, the most famous license of which is, pardon my French, but do whatever the fuck you want license.
That's not your proper name, isn't it?
It is,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Say what?
That's the most permissive. The license is do whatever the fuck you want. And I believe the statement in the license is, I don't care what you do whatever the fuck you want. That is, that you can't get more permissive than that. So somewhere between those licenses, try to find a way to protect the intention to share, but acknowledge the business needs for the particular variety of different scenarios. So we have licensing because there are business needs. Permissive licenses are on the rise. In 2012, the wild majority, orange is restrictive. The wild majority of licenses were quite restrictive. GPL was really popular. Now we've almost perfectly flip-flopped so that the MIT and Apache licenses are the most popular, and they are wonderfully permissive. So the trend is
But
changing.
it defined permissive is like you could make a profit. Well, you make a profit off of it anyway. But you could resell what you've done.
Yeah.
If you want to go, maybe I guess you'll end up describing permissive in a little more detail later. But
Yeah, none of these
Yeah.
licenses really get into the discussion of whether or not you make money from the code. So you can, in two different ways. So let's take Red Hat, for example. Red Hat gives its code away. It's called Fedora. And
actually, RHEL too.
yeah, RHEL, the code goes
Yeah.
with it. You're
Yeah.
really, when you buy a RHEL license, you're really paying
The
support.
support.
That's the magic part of it. And if you want to get into the R&D part of it, that's Fedora. Because they work out all of their kinks in the open source community. And then they bring it in, once it's really worked out, they bring that into Red Hat.
The people watching the stream are watching it through a Fedora workstation.
Okay, sure. So you're helping contribute to RHEL's
Yes,
financial model.
I do contribute bug reports.
Yeah. So just using and reporting in the Fedora environment is part of what drives the business model of RHEL. Additionally, in addition to support, there's an enormous amount of consulting that goes along with Red Hat. They do a lot of security consulting, they do a lot of government consulting, they do a lot of corporate consulting, and they do more than just Linux-based stuff. Now, their solutions more often than not. The thing I really love about Red Hat is that when you have a problem, they will help you solve your problem. More often than not, the solution will have Linux at its base, but they don't really care if it does or not. And that really brings them closer to that place of being honest broker, which is a hard thing to do when you actually have the product you're selling. But I've been in many meetings with some senior folks, including the product owner for RHEL, where we were talking with the government about something, and he's like, okay, so this, and this will fix your problem. And he only sold one of those items, but he would work out the engineering for everything else. And then it's like, okay, well, we're selling other people's stuff here, and he just doesn't care, because we're solving a problem that you're paying us to help figure out the answer to. And sometimes they'll go solving problems that no one has identified or paid them to solve. So if you can do that well and open up a new space for yourself, that's a lot of money to be made there.
Question before we move forward
Yes,
is,
ma'am.
in terms of terminology, what does the term license connote here? A paid license? Is it a license of honor, like on the honor system? Is there different levels? I know you're going to talk about licenses here, but the word seems to be bandied around a bit.
So a license is any agreement between two parties on how you are going to get stuff that I have.
Okay.
It's pretty broad. Some of the licenses are paid for, and some of the licensing includes things that are not really, or it includes the source code, but you're paying for something else. As Mark pointed out, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you're paying for the support and maintenance. You're also paying for a physical copy of the code. Do they still do that? Still send you a CD?
Well, they have to. The GPL requires it.
Okay, so the physical,
Well, not their support code. That's different.
right.
That's
But you
different.
get a physical medium, I think, was one of their things that they used to do.
Or the ability to call, or the ability to call their help desk and actually get support.
Yeah,
That's the big part.
yeah. I remember we used to get the CDs for RHEL, and we would play Frisbee with them. You buy it, you download it, you use it, and then a week later you get a package in the mail with the same thing you just downloaded. So we were doing this for clients all the time. So we had boxes of these things, and it's, we'd have fun throwing them at each other, like you used to do with the AOL CDs that were ubiquitous. So license covers all of those things. Any situation or requirements that go into that, it's a pretty broad term.
And like any contract, a license can be for a period of time or indefinite?
Well, license is not necessarily a contract
Okay.
per se. It can be if both parties have to agree to it, and you've stipulated that there's an acceptance mechanism such as a signature.
Mm-hmm.
Open source licenses don't have an acceptance
Don't, okay.
mechanism. So therefore, it doesn't qualify as a contract in most
Okay.
cases.
How does it be, and if there's ever a legal conflict, how is it resolved?
So then the person who holds, and this is true of all contracts, licenses, or
Right.
any type of IP, the person who holds the right to the IP is the one who has to take the action against the other party.
Okay.
So if I find out that you're violating my GPL rights and not forwarding or not including my software in your distribution, you're only including the stuff that you wrote, and you're making people go somewhere else to get my part of it,
Mm-hmm.
I can bring suit against you and force you to come back into line or stop using my product.
Okay.
Most popular licenses, according to Black Duck as of last year, the MIT license is the big winner at almost 40% of the market. The GNU, which is kind of GPL version 2, is 14%, and the next winner is Apache. ISC, which I'm not that familiar with, is 10%. GNU version 3 is still around. Most people are swinging over to GPL version 2. And then BDSD version 2 is still hanging out there quite a bit. The artistic license, which Perl, we mentioned earlier, is under that. Most folks aren't really using that anymore from what I understand, but the numbers will tell a different story. And then different versions of the GPL wrap it up. And the Eclipse license is the bottom of number 10. Surprisingly, Microsoft makes it on the list. Microsoft's new foray into open source is an interesting thing to watch. I don't know much about it. I'm just kind of watching it unfold.
That'll be next month's presentation.
Okay.
Really,
You
Microsoft.
hinted I would talk about it, but I don't know enough to talk about that area. And the do what the fuck you want to the public license is actually on there, less than 1%.
The ISC licenses from the Internet Systems Consortium. It's GPL compatible. It's OSI approved. It is not copyleft.
Okay. Does it tag up with the W3C folks?
I'm looking at the wiki page for it right now. I don't see anything. It's license appears says permission to use, copy, modify, and distribute this software for any purpose with or without fee is hereby granted, provided that the above copyright notice and this permission notice appear in all copies. And there's some other stuff. I've seen it on GitHub a lot.
Okay.
A lot of other. I was noticing, like, I was like, oh yeah, 10%, that makes sense, because you see that on a GitHub project.
Cool. I haven't contributed a line of code in a long time. It's been a long time. I've been more on the policy side of things. So
Have you seen what GitHub is doing recently with the licensing?
I have not.
They'll, if you include a license in any form, really, like as long as it's text-based, in your project,
Mhm.
it'll show up on the like the summary
Oh,
bar.
cool.
So it'll be like the name of your project, the like primary code that is written in,
Mhm.
number of contributors, something else, and then the actual license. Like
Cool.
They're bringing
Yeah.
that right to the
That's
front.
good.
And when you start a repository, you can
Yeah.
drop
Yeah.
down and select it, and it'll give you that text and copyright it in your whatever your username is.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's very cool. Makes
For
it
a
super
long
easy.
time, they got a lot of criticism for not having the licensing it up front, and people were just sucking code into other projects. So that's a good move on their part. All right, so visually, same information.
That's one of the things that you just touched on, Caleb, is the interesting thing for, actually, I think you're about to talk about it there, where you have an open source project
Mm-hmm.
that or a project that you're writing that uses open source, let's take Node.js, which pulls in 10,000 different projects just to build like 30 lines of code.
Mm-hmm.
Each one of those projects has probably a different license. And being able to correctly follow each of those licenses is probably impossible.
Not impossible, but there are companies that will do that for you.
Yeah.
Black Duck is probably the most prominent of them.
Yeah.
Companies can become liable for not making sure all those different situations are covered and that the licensing is actually taken care of. In 2009, if I remember the statistic, companies were, I forgot the stat, the number 82 comes to mind. I don't remember if it's 82% of companies didn't know they were using open source software, or 82% of companies had not taken into account how they were incorporating licenses
Or
of other.
82 companies in the entire world even knew what open source was.
That's possible too. All right, so licenses have to work together if you're going to combine projects or subsume something into something else. So you write something in Perl, the Perl license gets ported essentially into your project if you're going to release your project as open source. Some of these things work together naturally. BDSD works very well with GPL and other versions and variants of the GPL. And some of those, LGPL works well with later versions of the GPL, but not all GPL even works with itself. As you can see, GPL version 2.1 does not work with GPL version 3. So a lot of different things you need to just take into account, and I don't have the knowledge to get into the details of what those are because I am not a lawyer, and I hope to never say I'm interested in the law. I've spent enough time with lawyers, I don't know how I haven't committed homicide at this point.
Hypothetically, if you started with something BSD licensed as a base, and you developed something using it as a dependency for something further, so you've developed it further, but then you wanted to relicense your release as GPL, that means that all that former BSD stuff that you've now relicensed as GPL has to be GPL because it's intermingled with the other. It's not a module.
Right.
It's not a plugin. It's not a separate thing.
Right.
It's components. So you've turned that thing into GPL. But if you wanted to take GPL and go back to something permissive, you can't do that because
Correct.
the GPL won't let you do that.
Correct.
So it's like a ratchet. Once you cross it, you can't go back.
Correct.
Yeah.
Depending on the source license or the starting point
Well,
license.
depending on the starting point. If you start with permissive, you can make that restricted,
Yes.
but you can't go back the other way. If you start restricted, you're stuck with the GPL type.
Yep. And that's a
distribution.
very important aspect
Yeah.
of that. I remember having some conversations with Gunnar at Red Hat, and he had just gotten into some heat over using, I think, Apache for something. Because it was too permissive for the scenario that they were releasing that particular thing under. Because it was developed for a particular client, for a particular circumstance, and there were some needs that had to be met contractually between the two companies to do the custom work. So while the funding company wanted to put it out there, they wanted to put it out there a certain way, and they had to figure out how to deal with that. I never heard how that resolved, by the way. But it happens, even at Red Hat. They run into these challenges, and they have lawyers to deal with it for them. That's really important.
That's one of the reasons that Fedora doesn't have some of the things that make stuff work that, say, Ubuntu does, because they are very careful about the licensing.
Yes.
They're extremely conservative in that way.
Yes.
Can I interject? I'm probably off topic, but so if you have a license that says you must, and which majority of them do say you must include a copy of the license. So what does it exactly mean? Is that a copy of the link to the license? Is that the actual text? So let's say you're on let's say you're on Google's code page, right? They say all the code samples are Apache, right? So how are you going to include? They don't even supply you with that. Their copyright notice. They're just telling you that it's Apache. How then do you include the proper citation of that?
So the easiest way is to drop a text file in the root of your project. That's the easiest way. You can, in the documentation, link to it, depending on how the language is worded in the license that you're subsuming, is gonna determine how it is. There's always room for interpretation because language is innately limited. So it just depends on if they explicitly spell out how they want you to do it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Then what supersedes that if then they have a, let's say they say it's Apache, and then they have a link that shows how they want their, you know, how they want it to be cited, and it may or may not match up between the licensing. What supersedes?
So if they provide a link and say this is how to do
Usage,
it,
right.
use it. That's the easiest thing to do.
Right.
If they simply say anything, if they say provide a copy, drop the text file. If they say you must also license this under, then however you want to reference that. Folks using the Creative Commons, the common practice is to not provide the copy, but to
Right.
link to the Creative Commons website.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I was asking. I see a lot of that.
So yeah, it just depends on what how you can interpret, how much
Yeah,
room they leave
right.
to interpretation. And if you, like I said earlier, if you get a lawyer in the room, he can sit down and come up with 5 different ways
I'm
to
sure.
do that. And if you ever have to deal with lawyers, one of the ones I was working with at the Department of Energy made a really insightful comment because he would take different positions every time he talked at CNA. And finally, somebody called him out on it because there's 5 people on the meeting, and they said, "Rob, you're hitting different positions different times we talk." And he goes, "Yeah, that's what we do. Lawyers are not judges. Judges make decisions. Lawyers help you understand all the different perspectives that you have to deal with." So know that when you're talking to a lawyer, they're not innately trained to make decisions. So they will drive you round and round and round and round and round. So
That's why they get paid by the hour.
yeah,
I'm saying
I thought that was
that.
going to be a punchline to the joke,
Yeah.
but
My
It's
mom's a
true.
lawyer, so.
gotcha.
I would tend to think any text document that's not a link is at risk of being tampered with, and whereas the link is much more would be more secure because they can control what goes into the link and easier. Because if you have to update that file, if it's a text file, you're constantly having to rely upon that text that you're editing. Whereas if you are going to connect to a link, that information has already been updated by that particular.
Well, it depends
Developer
on who you
vendor.
trust.
What's that?
It depends on who you trust and what you're trusting in. So if you're
Right.
trusting in the owner or the maintainer of the license
Right.
to keep this version of the license that I used on this date in 2008,
Right.
then you're trusting them. But
Right.
if you don't trust them, say they have a history of changing their licenses retroactively, and that's you're afraid they might make a retroactive change that affected what you did on a particular
Yeah.
date in the past, then you would want to include a copy yourself so that that link, what's contained in that link, might not change.
That's a valid concern. GitHub would probably protect against that because
It would have
it would show cryptographically
Yes.
because of the way Git works.
Right.
You know, any changes and show Git blame who did it.
Exactly, for non-repudiation. Yeah, because you think about it, you know, the malcontents that are still out there would tamper with these files and do as much damage as they can in terms of the business model by attempting at least to ruin a business relationship by virtue of changing that text without permission.
And that's possible. It would depend on who you trust. If you include a physical copy in your CD or your deliverable, whatever that is,
Right.
then no one can edit that from the CD, right?
Right.
You got an uneditable, assuming you're not using
Right.
rewritable CDs.
Well, that word trust is also a key thing because when you're not dealing with businesses to business, you're dealing with people to people in every situation, and things can change, unfortunately. When somebody leaves the company, they die, you have to reestablish a new level of trust.
Yep.
So if the original was written by somebody else, and how do you know that? Well, you would know. Do they give you like a formal 90-day notice that they're changing their agreement, or is it just sprung on you that they're changing it? And then you gotta go through all your, your software and change it all.
Well, this goes back to the intention of the creator.
Yeah.
So the
Right.
creator's intention is to distribute, and they don't include typically an acceptance mechanism. So when you start using that license, it's legally you're bound by it when you, as long as you're using the software.
Right, it's like any contract, anything that supersedes it, still is still in force.
Right. But if you've got an old copy of software
Yeah,
and the license on there says X, Y, or Z, but the newest version that's out there has different restrictions, you're not using the newest version, you're using the old version, so you're bound by the old license. So, but if you update, now you're bound by the new license.
okay.
All right, so the power of intention. Software owners, as we talked about already, they're in open source. Their intention is to provide really raw material for your future. Instead of the illustration I like to go back to is the two military illustrations that really fit. When we invaded Normandy, the famous D-Day operation, Operation Overlord. Once we got past the beaches, the first thing we ran into was these ancient hedgerows that were common. A hedgerow is not just a hedge like a bush, it is a buildup over hundreds of years where this bush line has had rocks thrown into it and all kinds of other things, and it has been cut back and maintained as essentially a wall. And the tanks could not actually push through them because they were so dense and intertwined. The branches and stuff were so intertwined. So what somebody came up with the idea of was creating these piercing pieces of metal that they would just weld to the front of a tank, and it would pierce and break apart. And you could then push through. Once this was kind of figured out, they just repeated it on everyone who had to work in France. That idea of being repeatable and quickly replicated is really the intention of open source. It's the concept of we give you a tool and you're using that in ways that we never imagined. It's the raw material to go do something else. We never intended our project, Perl, for example, it was never intended to be the end all itself. It was meant to be a tool people use to go do other things. WordPress, Drupal, those are, no one puts up a Drupal site to go, isn't it a beautiful Drupal? You know, it's there. And I just like looking at the default screen and I'm going to show the world this thing. No, they use it as a tool to build their website, customize it, make it what they need. Weapons, same way. You got M4 is the standard issue now, I think. The schematics for that can be licensed and are licensed to many different manufacturers. But if we treated software the same way we treat, or if we treated weapons the same way we treat software, if you needed to reload your weapon, you would have to go back to the original manufacturer. If you needed to put a Picatinny rail on it, you'd have to go back to the manufacturer. If you wanted to put a tactical light on it, you'd have to go back to the manufacturer. If you wanted to do anything to that weapon, you'd have to go back to the original manufacturer. Open source is different in that it's much more like the way we handle weapons. The schematics for the weapon are there, and anyone who wants to create a thing to fit it is welcome to. And you license it and sell it, and everyone's happy. Once we get our heads around the idea that now that we are in the digital age up to our eyeballs, nothing is really going to be a finished product anymore. Everything is going to be somebody else's raw material. I think it'll make it a lot easier for the general public to get their heads around the idea that I can leverage something and keep moving forward, and everyone makes a good living off of that, and that's not a problem.
What software anywhere doesn't include libraries that someone else has written?
True. True.
People who write in C.
Well, C is supposed to include, whatever .h and you need to put in there, so you're still pulling libraries from something as well.
Unless they write it all from scratch like we do.
Yeah. There's a joke about ancient languages somewhere in there. I'll let you figure out what the punchline is. I don't know it yet.
Pearl.
Perl. Perl was one of the first languages. So, knowing that this concept of software being somebody else's raw material, that's the foundation of a lot of people's livelihoods and a lot of future innovations that we have not yet even come to. Open source software is essentially ubiquitous at this point in history. From 2005 to 2010, OSS increased from 12 to 25% of a $673 billion market. That's a big market. There are 2.4 million software projects that are open source as of last year. This data is provided by Black Duck and Fiestra. There are 2,500 different unique OSI acknowledged licenses. That's a lot. It's everywhere. 78% of companies run open source, knowingly. Only 3% of companies do not use open source in any way, shape, or form.
No.
That's Black Duck. So Black Duck, their role is to provide legal insurance against accidentally running into
Yeah,
licensing problems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So their code base is the most comprehensive of anyone's in the world. So when they're running code queries against their license instructors, they've got the best answer of anyone out there. I don't think it's a perfect answer, but it's the best that there is. And it's pretty reliable. Their record in court's pretty good. So open source business models. This is the reason we have licensing, is because people are conducting business around this stuff, right? If this was just the projects like the Homebrew Club way back when Bill Gates was just getting out of jail. Yes, sorry for the reference. No one would really care. We just pass around copies of code and it'd be fine. But people are making money off of open source. Business models have to balance property rights versus efficiency. And this is really true in open source or not open source. Proprietary companies and companies building around proprietary models have the same challenges. How can we be most efficient and still, keep everyone employed and grow our shareholders' bottom lines? So there are, I think, 10 open source licensing models that we're going to talk about. And this is taken from a good article by Carlo D'Afra. I can't pronounce his last name. I've kind of repackaged it to make it easier in the spirit of open source. But the key areas that he talks about, I'm going to go from most popular down to the least popular on the top 10 here. Dual licensing is the common situation that you run into because companies have been around for a while, have had to cross the bridge of we've got something proprietary like SQL, we need to make it open source or provide some bridge to that. So they'll incorporate the things that have already been done under proprietary models, and they will simply have a dual licensing scenario. You'll find a lot of those are pay to use because of the proprietary parts of them. MySQL is probably the biggest example of that situation. But they kind of provide a combination of those proprietary and open source licenses. Then there's open core, where the key component that makes the software what it is open source. And then other people have added stuff on that may or may not have been incorporated by the company, and then you've got to deal one-offs with each of those. Then you've got product specialists like Acquia that own Drupal. And they've created a product, and then they are the biggest consultant on that product. So when WhiteHouse.gov went over to Drupal, Acquia was involved. Nice big fat contract for them. and they did a good job of it. And then the White House released all that work under the open source license and put it all out there for the public. So good on them. Platform providers, Red Hat. We think of RHEL, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. It is not just an operating system. It is a very powerful platform. And a lot of the things that they have included, OpenStack and all of those other things, have grown from that platform. And you've got a whole area up there. This is where you start getting mission critical environments. SLAs, you're really going to pay a lot of money for the SLAs when you get into this scenario. And you need the support there. If something goes wrong, the company won't be able to do business. The government won't be able to function in some environments if they're fully reliant. So you've got to get into those deep areas where it's going to cost, but you need it regardless of which way you go. Software selection. You don't really understand your requirements, but we're experts, so we're going to help you understand those requirements and provide options for you. There's a lot of money to be made in consulting. And if you're not part of the solution, there's a lot of money to be made from prolonging the problem is the other side of that joke, right? So integrators, aggregate support providers is what Carlo calls these. This is where you're pulling multiple things together. I've got a mission that's going to require e-commerce, in-shop, direct in-person commerce, inventory management, and all of these different things. I needed a company to come to me and tell me how to put these pieces together and which pieces to put together and then do the integration itself. That is a very good space to make a good living in this world of open source. And then once you're getting to Black Duck, we talked about a second ago, providing legal certification and insurance. One of the statements that has been around for a long time is when we figure out how to truly ensure the situation with the licensing is when you will know open source has taken over the market. Because when you can ensure it, then it's a different game. And it will be a fairly standardized game at that point. We will know what we're dealing with and how to deal with different aspects of uncertainty. So right now it's a small aspect of it, but it is a thing that as you watch the industry grow, watch the insurance situation. That'll tell you a lot about the maturity of the industry. Indirect revenues, companies like Mozilla, they get paid to do the research, and this type of situation is the fastest, biggest way to get adoption of your open source project. You also have to have a very, very rich benefactor or a group of very rich benefactors to keep your project going, because you will not make a single penny from the thing that you actually are producing. They will produce it because they need what you're putting out, but it's a whole different line of that. It also gives you a lot of freedom to do research and go exploring into areas that you would not really have a business model to otherwise. Training and documentation. Mark and I have done some of that together. Most companies don't really care to know about what they're getting into. They just need to know that somebody can help me get this taken care of if I need it and teach me how to use the stuff. And then research and development. This is where you share the cost of research and development. The Linux Foundation projects are probably the best example at this point. Before it was Eclipse. But if you're familiar with the Linux Foundation, it doesn't just exist to keep Linus Torvalds paid. It has also got into a lot of side projects where it's looking at what are the commonalities between different industry areas. For example, you mentioned IoT at the beginning of this talk. Some of the core aspects of IoT are going to be there. And the Linux Foundation's model has been how can we get industry to collaborate on the shared aspects and then write their own modifications to make the thing theirs. So in-car entertainment systems is a really good example. They've gotten a lot of industry partners to work together to write the core so that there's going to be a universal standard across multiple different types of phones, not just Android and Apple, but whatever might come along in the future. And Then you do the 60 to 80% together. And then you go off and you don't tell your competitors about the other 20% that makes your product unique. Why I would want to buy a Chevy because it's got this car feature, or why I'm going to buy a BMW because it's got this car feature, or why I'm going to buy a Ford because of that. You do the things, you work together on the common parts that everyone's got to cross the bridge on. And that's where the Linux Foundation has really focused its efforts over the past 10 years, is doing those type of things. IoT is an area that they're trying to get involved in, and I don't have the names of those projects on the top of my head, but that model is actually a very smart model. And it's also one that I really like because it brings competitors together in a way that acknowledges that we are competitors, but we still are going to be friendly competitors instead.
What's interesting about that fact is all these competing companies that are actually contributing to the Linux kernel, as an example.
Mhm.
You know, Red Hat, HP, IBM.
Yeah.
They're competitors in a way,
Yes.
but they're still contributing to this thing that they all use. It
Exactly.
goes back to the community aspect we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. People don't make up the community as much as companies make up the community, but this company is driven by people in the community.
Yes.
It's a weird way of saying it. So, balancing these fundamental concerns, property versus efficiency. If they don't do this well, they're going to kill themselves and their business model. If you look at the idea that you're dealing with the property itself, you wind up, if your focus is on property rights, is a better way of saying it, then you wind up with more restrictive licensing. Open core, dual licensing, those situations are the extreme. If you wind up with efficiency being your goal, you wind up with less restrictive. And you also wind up in these areas of consulting where you're actually not dealing with the license itself. It opens up to all kinds of doors. Somewhere in between is where most everything else falls. And it's a spectrum that is not a either or. Now let's talk about open source in government. For years, we really only had 3 places to play unless you were a lone wolf. You had the military open source community, you had Open Source for America, and you had Code for America. Those were the 3 big ones. Or you could just go be the crazy person howling at the moon in your agency, right? And a lot of us were. You know, you've got folks like Dave Wheeler at IDA. He's writing about open source before it's a thing. And what brought it to his attention was the national security aspects of not just adaptability, but resiliency was the word that brought it up to his, in his worldview. He comes at it from a defense perspective, and the idea of being able to rapidly modify and redeploy code was a resiliency measure in his mind. And so that kind of opened up a whole discussion. And he's been able to do an enormous amount of research and put out quite a bit of very useful stuff since then. And that was a while back. I think 2009 was when he started doing that work. And this is a fun fact. The same year, Eric Raymond published The Cathedral and the Bazaar, an Air Force major wrote a paper that was the first acknowledgement of the government's use of open source. So people think that the government's been way behind the open source curve, and in publicly acknowledging and writing policy for it, they have, but they have been using it since the early days. And they've been using it in mission critical areas without people realizing it. Now we've got the federal source code policy. If you want to go to sourcecode.cio.gov, you can read the policy itself. And now we've got code.gov, which is an outcropping of that, where we have to share our code. If the software is paid for by the taxpayers and there's no reasonable restriction for national security reasons, it should be publicly available. And that is an exciting thing. When the source code policy was being worked out, because of my involvement, I was actually invited personally to go comment on and participate in the roundtable discussions of that whole thing. That was interesting. very interesting. And then when I went to energy, I got to actually, the code had been implemented, or the policy had been implemented. I got to be the lead pen for writing the energy's policy and brokering out how they would work with the labs. That was, politics of that was not fun, but they actually got where they needed to go, so I was excited. And then I left. All right, so let's go look at the federal government. The major things that have happened there. 1997, I just mentioned. Air Force Major Seraph, I can't pronounce his name, I'm gonna try. Writes an article called Internet Hallway Systems Based on Linux. It's the first acknowledgement of open source use in government. He published that in the Linux Journal. 1997, been doing this for a while. 1998, the NSA releases SE Linux. I think everyone's heard of SE Linux by now.
Still turn it off.
What?
I still turn it off.
Oh no, set and force 1.
So, a fun fact,
I see when it's on.
most of the, what office is it? ODNI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, when you're walking around, almost all you see is Linux workstations. Because you can, not just logically, but you can actually sandbox the containers where they can run multiple systems into the same physical box and maintain the legal separation between those systems that they have to have. So an analyst who used to have 6 computers at his desk because the FBI data cannot merge with or be anywhere near being contaminated with CIA data because they have different missions, they can all do that in one Linux box. You can't do that on Windows or Mac. So they are pretty at their desktops using Linux as an everyday tool. In 1999, the first procurement guidance to include open source is issued by the Air Force. In 2003, the big famous MITRE study finds that without realizing it, the DoD has developed a reliance at mission critical levels on open source software. And no one has thought of policy at this point for open source, just how to buy it. And it was a kind of a side note at that. So, Secretary of Defense, Stenbit, issues a memo saying open source, good, go use it. And everyone went, wait a second, it's free. We're not allowed to use freeware. We've got a lot of policy memos saying no freeware on DoD systems.
There's
because-
still a lot of confusion on that.
Yeah.
A lot of misunderstanding.
So, for a decade, no one uses it because we don't know what the lawyers will say about freeware if we're not paying for it. So, a few companies like Red Hat, Gunnar Hellickson particularly said, we've got to get this through the certification and accreditation process. And he took on the effort of getting RHEL through CNA, knowing that they will not sell to the government until they get through that process. So he went on, it was a huge task to get it. He finally got it done, and it was paid off for Red Hat in spades. That is the reason you see Red Hat and not Ubuntu in use in the federal government, is because Ubuntu is unwilling to take that step until they have a sales reason to do so. They've said, Mark Shuttleworth, I was in a meeting with him years ago where he said, when we've got a business reason to do it, we'll do it. We would love to be in the federal government. It's a huge marketplace for us, but we can't get there until we cross those bridges and we don't have a viable business reason. It's just a gamble to cross those bridges. Red Hat took the gamble. Red Hat's doing well because of that. In 2004, OMB issued guidance that basically mirrored the Stenbit memo, so 1 year later. And then that same year, NASA released Whirlwind, which is a global positioning system visualizer, and they released it under the brand new NASA open source agreement. So that's the first government license is in 2004. Then in 2006, DoD publishes its first open technology development roadmap, and that's the first time the government has tried to align open source development principles to the mission of DoD. That's a significant step or shift in thinking about how we are looking at not just the software licensing situation, but the perspective of how software is developed. 2007, the Navy commissions open source contributions, to the Linux kernel that are necessary for a new destroyer. I think that destroyer actually wound up being a liturgical. I'm getting confused with the word for
Littoral?
littoral. That's what I'm
Littoral,
looking for.
yeah. You're going to church here with us, right?
Well, littoral is going to be the shallow water.
Yeah.
Liturgical is going to be the church. It's two words very close together. The name of the ship is the USS Zumwalt, and it has actually become its own class of ship. It runs on Linux. So, the companies that were commissioned in 2007 by the Navy include Northrop Grumman, GE, and several other big players. It's funny that people who previously we thought of as proprietary vendors are no longer just proprietary vendors. Sorry, I'm going long. Take care. Good news,
Thank you,
Caleb.
thank you guys.
I am almost done. I think I've got one more slide. And then in 2009, the DoD finally clarifies this memo, the extended memo with the DoD open source memo. It establishes open source as COTS, and it encourages its reuse and lays out a good reason for its use as open source. Dan Reisacker, if you know him, he actually wrote that memo. Dave Wenegren, who was the Deputy Undersecretary for Defense at the time, walked in and he goes, "You're the open source geek in the office. We need a policy that makes me sound like the most enlightened deputy CIO that's ever existed." and at that point, Dan Reisacker had experienced the out-of-body moment where he was just so thrilled that he almost lost bowel control. So he got to write that. I discussed that along with several other people with Dan. So we got kind of everything we ever wanted into that memo, and we got all the final roadblocks cleared for DoD. That same year, the White House released its code for whitehouse.gov, and 2 years later, DoD releases a lessons learned from its open technology development roadmap that it laid out several years earlier. And in 2011, the CIO for the federal government released the Share First policy, mandating code reuse where possible. So, if you write it, the taxpayers paid for it, share it. If you are a federal entity that needs to write software, you have to look inside what has already been written. Reuse what we've got. If you can't reuse, then you can go fund it. But now when software development is procured, they, by policy, have to find out and prove this doesn't already exist.
So is that something in the DFAR that a contracting officer has to certify that?
This is not made into DFARs yet. This is still OMB. So it is binding, but making stuff into the DFARS language, it takes a long time of letting these things get worked out on the hows before they'll actually make it into DFARS. Modifying DFARS is a pain, and more often than not, it's usually not worth it. So I remember when there was a discussion about, this was 2006, modifying the DFAR to address open source software. We actually made the argument, and this is we being MilOSS and Open Source for America. I've sat on steering committees of both of those organizations. We actually went to the hearing and made the argument we shouldn't modify the FAR because under these statutes and regulations, open source is COTS. You have laws for COTS. You've got COTS in the regulation. There's no reason to be given any special footing. It should just be all be treated the same, and let the right solution be what needs to be picked, not what licensing structure that was created under. So, more often than not, when you deal with the FAR and the DFAR and all the other baby FARs, or baby ARs, because every agency has its own acquisition regulation, right? A supplement. The principles are already in place, and unless you've got a really good reason to say your thing is different than the principle, that's when you need to get away from it. And in some situations there are. So Department of Energy, unique to all agencies, it has built into its mission in the DFAR, I'm sorry, not the DFAR, energy is the DEFAS, I I forgot its acronym, but Energy has its own supplement, right? Built into its mission is the sharing and advancement of energy technologies for the entire country and its allies. So from day one, before open source was ever a discussion, it had the obligation to share its research with the public. It can't create nuclear energy and go, yeah, we're not going to share that with anyone. So under that mission, people a lot of times, they remember the folks who were on the Manhattan Project and the guy who led that. What was his name?
I can remember Teller and some of the other names.
Edward Teller?
No, it wasn't Teller. It
Robert was his first. I thought maybe his first name was Robert.
Yes, I think his
I
first
didn't
name
realize
was
we'd have a
Robert.
history quiz
Robert,
today.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, he actually lost his security clearance because he was pushing for the sharing of nuclear technology. But this regulation existed before the nuclear program ever started. So he was saying, why aren't we living up to our own obligation? And he was building that argument, and national security folks were like, you're crazy. We just blew up 2 cities. Why would we want to share that? And he's like, well, we don't want to share that, but we want to share the fact that we could probably power cities with the same exact amount of uranium that we just blew up Nagasaki with. And they're like, yeah, too dangerous to let this out. And they actually revoked his security clearance. His name was German. He was not part of Project Paperclip, though. Anyway, I forgot. Where was I? Sorry for the tangent. CIA share first policy. Okay, and then in 2016, the federal source code policy is finally issued, demanding that agencies issue their own policies. One of the things in the 16 source code policy is that code.gov would be created as a repository for links to all the software projects that the federal government already has. This piece is actually a takeoff of the white paper I wrote for the Undersecretary of the Army back in 2007 or 2008 that says we should have a federal source code repository for things that have already been secured. And so once you cross the CNA, we should hold that. That was attempted in a project called SWAMP out of, I forgot who funded that. Anyway, there was a project that attempted to do that, and it was called SWAMP, and it was not successful. So they said, well, you've already got software repositories that you're running. DOE really has a ton. And they use them as an example. So they said, instead of us running a repository, you need to just show us where yours already are. And so it was kind of a balance between those two ideas. And that seems to be working pretty well. I think that's it. You can stop listening to me ramble now, or we can ask the questions.
Answered all my questions.
You answered all mine. Thank you.
And what you didn't know you had.
Well, it brings back memories when I was I never worked with coding in the military. The only I was in over 30 years ago, and I actually built a computer that we used for CPM.